A kill zone in this war is airspace, not a minefield, not a wall, a band several kilometers deep, 2 or 3 miles, watched by a cheap reconnaissance drone and hunted by cheaper strike drones. By 2024, it decided where a front line could move and where it could not. Near Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, Ukrainian units describe first-person view drones, FPVs, that cost as little as $300, launch roughly every 10 to 15 minutes per pilot, and hit their mark 20 to 40% of the time. The newest ones fly on a hair-thin fiber-optic cable instead of a radio link. Jamming does nothing to them because there is no signal to jam. Formations that once crossed this ground at platoon strength, 20 to 30 men, now cross it 2 at a time. Anything larger rarely arrives intact. So how does a machine that costs less than a laptop shut down ground an army cannot move through, and why can no jammer stop the newest ones? Soldiers on both sides call it a kill zone, sometimes an engagement zone. A stretch of ground one side has saturated with sensors and strike drones so thoroughly that nothing crosses it undetected or unengaged. No single weapon produces that effect. 2 cheap machines working together produce it, and by now both armies build their assault planning around them. The 2 machines are different, and the difference matters. The first is a reconnaissance drone, usually an ordinary quadcopter of the kind hobbyists have flown for a decade. It watches and reports position. That is the whole job. The second is the first-person view drone, the FPV, named for how the operator flies it, through a live video feed from a camera on its nose, wearing goggles, as though sitting inside the airframe. An FPV is a human-piloted one-way strike drone. The pilot can circle, wait, retarget, or call it off right up to the moment of impact. Loitering munition is the more common defense press label, though that term usually gets reserved for purpose-built systems, Russia's own Shahed and Garan among them. Drones that fly a preset course to a fixed point and, once launched, cannot be recalled at all. Outlets have not fully settled the terminology. The practical distinction holds regardless of the label. One of these machines has a person steering it until the last second, the other does not. Calling either one a kamikaze drone, the informal media catch-all, erases that difference, and the difference decides how each one gets countered. This episode is about the human-piloted kind and the ground it now owns. Terrain changes the size of a kill zone, not the method. Across the open steppe common to Zaporizhzhia and southern Donetsk, one can run its full several kilometers, because nothing blocks a reconnaissance drone's view of an approaching group. In built-up ground like Chasiv Yar or the Pokrovsk approach, ruined buildings shorten the sight line, and the same system compresses into a narrow band fought street by street instead of field by field. The sequence stays the same either way: watch, cue, strike, only the reach changes. The stakes come down to a price gap that keeps widening. A basic FPV runs $300 to $2,000 depending on components. Since the full-scale invasion began, the open-source project Oryx has visually confirmed more than 21,000 pieces of Russian equipment destroyed, tanks and armored vehicles included, and the running total climbs by the week. Oryx's own compilers describe that count as a floor, since it logs only what a photograph or video can prove. No analyst has published an audited figure for what it costs in drones to stop one infantry assault specifically, and a precise ratio for that trade does not exist in the public record. The territorial fact underneath it does exist. Whichever side controls the kill zone controls whether the front line moves at all. And across 2024 and 2025, in sector after sector, that control belonged less to whoever held the trench and more to whoever flew the drones. The chain that produces that control starts the moment a reconnaissance drone lifts off and ends the moment an FPV pilot finds a target. A kill zone runs on a chain, not on a single weapon. A quadcopter goes up first and watches. Once it flags movement, a strike cell cues an FPV pilot onto that exact position, often through a shared digital command app, Ukraine's Delta battlefield management system among them. which relays coordinates in seconds instead of over a radio. Ukrainian operators describe launching a strike drone roughly every 10 to 15 minutes per pilot this way, with a hit rate commonly cited between 20 and 40%. That is the baseline rhythm. It looks less like a dramatic strike and more like a production line of small engagements, running for as long as anything keeps moving through the ground it covers. What makes this hard to defeat comes down to a single wire. A conventional FPV flies on a radio link, the same kind of signal a remote control car uses, and a radio link can be jammed, flood the frequency with noise, and the picture the pilot sees goes dead. Russian electronic warfare, jamming pods and frequency-hopping detectors mounted on vehicles and towers, was built to do exactly that, and for a while it blunted the FPV threat well enough. Then fiber-optic drones arrived. Instead of a radio link, the drone trails a hair-thin cable behind it, 15 to 20 kilometers of it for Ukrainian models, roughly 9 to 12 miles, with Russian versions reported reaching 30 kilometers. The cable spools out physically as the drone flies, and the video signal travels down the wire instead of through the air. One Ukrainian operator described the effect plainly. Flying on fiber means operating in total radio silence, invisible to any system built to detect or jam a radio signal, because there is no signal there to catch. Think of a walkie-talkie against a telephone on a landline. Jam the airwaves all you like, the call on the wire keeps going. Reported strike probabilities show the size of the gap. Fiber-optic FPVs succeed around half the time, against roughly 30% or lower for radio-controlled drones fighting through jamming in the same contested airspace. The cable is not invulnerable. It can be physically cut or snagged, and that stays the countermeasure that works. Against jamming specifically, a fiber drone is close to immune. A fiber-optic build runs around $1,200 for a 10-kilometer range model, more than a basic radio FPV, and still a fraction of anything it is sent to stop. Reaching the target is only half the job. Against armor, most FPV warheads are a shaped charge, a design that focuses the blast into a narrow, fast-moving jet of metal rather than spreading it. So a 1 or 2 kilogram charge punches through hull plating that a much larger warhead would only scorch. That is the physics that lets a 2-kilogram drone disable a vehicle worth vastly more than itself. Against a fighting position rather than a vehicle, a fragmentation warhead does the work instead, scattering the blast rather than focusing it. There is a human cost on both sides of this exchange. It is real, and it is not the subject here. The machines and the ground they contest are. Volume matters as much as sophistication. A fire crew with 4 trucks cannot answer 9 fires lit in the same minute, however fast each truck moves. A defending position inside a kill zone faces the same arithmetic. More drones launched than any counter-drone rifle, net, or jamming system can physically engage in the same window. That arithmetic is why thinning a kill zone rarely comes down to one clever piece of hardware. It comes down to having enough countermeasures in enough places at the same time. Both sides know this, which is why the sequence rarely stays one-sided for long. Russian units have answered with a counter-tactic of their own. Small teams, often 3 to 5 men and mostly drone operators themselves, push into basements and shattered buildings ahead of the main force and build a competing sensor screen that contests the kill zone from inside it instead of jamming it from a distance. Defense reporting on the Kostiantynivka sector credits the method with buying an advance of roughly 1 kilometer a week, on ground where almost everything turns on whether a kill zone is holding. A newer and more limited countermeasure is starting to appear on both sides, drones built to intercept other drones in the air. Reports of these interceptors are still sparse and localized, and none of them describe a fielded system. That absence, rather than any radio jammer, is the kill zone's biggest unsolved problem right now. Named units on the Ukrainian side have built reputations around running this system well. The strike drone force led by the officer with the call sign Madyar, publicly known as Madyar's Birds, And drone elements of the 13th Kartia Brigade of Ukraine's National Guard have flown this exact Watch-Q strike chain in the Kharkiv sector. Within Ukraine's Azov formations, a fiber-optic FPV element of the 12th Special Forces Brigade has flown the same sequence near Toretsk. None of that changes the physics of the chain. What it shows is spread. The tactic stopped being one unit's trick and became doctrine that many units run, which leaves the question of what that doctrine has done to the ground it covers, in named sectors, with numbers behind it. The pattern shows up by name across the front, and the spread is itself part of the evidence. Near Kurakhove in October 2024, Ukrainian forces reported repelling as many as 50 separate attacks in a single day across a cluster of named settlements, a count that climbed past that within the week. That frequency only makes sense if the attacking side keeps pushing small groups back into the same ground instead of committing one large force once. At Outrun in April 2024, Russian forces spent nearly 2 weeks probing before a breach let them exploit a gap in Ukrainian rotation and take the settlement by month's end. It was studied afterward as a template for how small group infiltration eventually succeeds, when a kill zone briefly thins rather than fails outright. Through 2025 and into early 2026, campaign assessments around Pokrovsk and Dobropilya describe Russian regiments advancing, in their own reporting, primarily in small infantry groups rather than formed units. That is the descendant of the platoon scale losses described earlier. One documented instance from that period logged as many as 30 FPV strikes against a single Ukrainian position in one engagement window. That is a specific reported case, not a nightly average, and it should be read as one. Kurakhove Yar tells a related but separate story. Defense reporting through 2025 credits Ukrainian drone units with holding the advantage over the town itself, and Russia answered with more specialized drone formations rather than with more infantry, including elements grouped under Russia's own Rubicon Center for Advanced Unmanned Technologies, operating near Kostyantynivka. Same doctrine race, different unit. Drone operator against drone operator settled before the fight ever reaches a rifleman. Whoever fields the denser, better shielded drone screen currently holds that stretch of the line. If the mechanics behind that race are what brought you here rather than the headlines, that is what this channel does. Now for the record's honest edges. Not every figure in this story is confirmed to the same standard. Around Kupyansk, a Ukrainian drone unit has claimed to deny Russian vehicle movement within 20 to 25 kilometers of the front and infantry movement within 1 kilometer of it. The same unit credits the kill zone with stopping as much as 88% of Russian personnel attempting to cross. That number comes from the unit that benefits from it. Treated as a claim, not a verified statistic. The Institute for the Study of War's own independent judgment, relayed in the same assessment, is narrower. If that effect could be replicated theater-wide, it would likely deny Russian advances outright. That is a statement about potential, not a confirmation that it has already happened. Near Vovchansk, one Ukrainian border guard soldier described Russian small group infiltrators as quickly destroyed. That is one soldier's field account, not an institutional count, and it is presented as exactly that. What does hold up at the institutional level is why Russia keeps sending men into this ground at all. The Institute for the Study of War's own assessment states that Russian command prioritizes attritional infantry assaults with poorly trained recruits, some of whom get as little as a month of preparation. The aim is a grinding advance, accepted at an elevated casualty rate per square kilometer gained. ISU ties that partly to political perception and negotiating leverage rather than to pure battlefield logic. Some commentary attributes the same persistence to command incentives that reward forward movement regardless of cost. That mechanism is not sourced the way ISU's assessment is, so hold it as informed inference rather than settled fact. The production numbers explain why neither side can simply outbuild the other. Ukraine's defense ministry reports monthly FPV output growing from roughly 20,000 units in 2024 to well over 100,000 attack variants a month by 2025, and past 150,000 a month, reconnaissance types included, by early 2026, spread across some 500 manufacturers where fewer than 10 existed before the invasion. Some Ukrainian officials have cited higher capacity figures still. This is the more conservative-sourced estimate. It is also a claim from the government running the war, and it is read as one here. The same standard applied to every figure in this script. The shape of it is corroborated independently. The research group RUSI estimated Ukraine's reconnaissance and strike drones spending at $1 to $2 billion over the war's first 2.5 years, a figure that single-year budget reporting since suggests is now conservative, and a scale that comes out of a manufacturing base rather than scattered workshops. Russia is not standing still either. Independent defense industry analysts put Russian fiber-optic FPV output alone above 50,000 units a month, a figure from industry watchers rather than from Moscow, carrying the same caveat as Kiev's number. A kill zone behaves like a fire that stays lit only while someone keeps feeding it. Cleverness is not what holds the ground. It holds because a factory somewhere replaces every drone that flew into it this morning, and does it again tomorrow. That is also why the confirmed record runs behind reality. The Oryx figures cited earlier covers every cause of loss since the invasion began, drones included but not drones alone, and it stays a floor for the reason given earlier. It logs only what a camera captured. In a kill zone, most of what happens is never filmed. The thing worth carrying out of this is not any single engagement. The kill zone has turned into a standing feature of this war's geography, closer to weather than to an event. Assessments of the 2024 and 2025 fighting describe assault formations compressing from platoon strength to squads and, in places, to pairs of two, precisely because anything larger stopped arriving intact. When a tactic visibly changes the size of the force sent against it, the argument about whether it works is already over. The ratio of fiber optic to radio-controlled FPVs on both sides is worth tracking from here, because that number reads out directly on who holds the electronic warfare advantage in a given sector. Reported assault group size is the second thing to track, since it now works as an informal barometer of how well the local kill zone is functioning. The third is the drone-on-drone interceptor programs both sides are only beginning to field. A machine built to kill another machine in the air, rather than jam a signal or cut a cable, is the first answer to fiber-optic guidance that anyone has actually fielded, instead of merely proposing. Whichever side gets there first changes who owns the kill zone next. None of this makes the war simpler, and none of it should be read as triumphant. The system described here has cost lives on both sides of the wire, and it will keep doing so for as long as it holds ground more cheaply than any alternative either side has found. What it explains is why a battlefield this saturated with cheap sensors and cheap strike drones no longer moves the way front lines moved a decade ago. The next shift is unlikely to come from a bigger weapon. It will come from whichever side first finds a reliable way to blind the drone that is already watching, before it gets the chance to call in the shot.